David Littleproud. David, thank you very much for joining us, and especially on Easter Sunday. Let's start off with the voice to Parliament. As we just saw there, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke to Kieran Gilbert on AM Agenda this morning about the voice. Kieran asked the PM if he could make a peace offering to Peter Dutton on regarding the Liberal Party getting over the line to support the referendum. Let's just take a quick listen to what happened.
Can you extend an olive branch to Peter Dutton now, though? Is it still not too late? Is there time for you to say, OK, we could remove the words executive government if you come on board? Is there a chance you might be able to offer that during this process? We know the parliamentary committee is looking at it. Are you willing to compromise on that to get the bipartisanship that would boost the chances of the referendum?
Well, Peter Dutton's already declared his position. David Littleproud declared the position of the National Party last year. It is very hard for them to argue they're participating in this committee process in good faith. They've already declared their position. And it's a bit like saying that you're going to run on the field in a footy game and just allow the other team, in this case the no team, to just run through and score tries without trying to tackle them and trying to defend the yes position.
David Littleproud, is there any room for movement with the Nationals?
We've made it clear from the start that our principal position against the voice is the fact that it's a representative body. If you strip away the constitutional recognition, I sense my party room has no opposition to that whatsoever. In fact, would wholeheartedly support that. But what's happened is this intertwining of a representative body into constitutional recognition that has far-reaching implications, but will simply add another layer of bureaucracy. So we've lived with a representative body before, and we've lived with the consequences. We are repeating history here. We had this thing called ATSIC, and those consequences and those mistakes are about to be revisited. Now, we believe that we've come a long way in closing the gap in many parts of the country, but where it hasn't is particularly in the rural and remote areas. And we look at this through the unique lens of representing those communities. So what we say is we don't need another layer of bureaucracy, we just need a better bureaucracy. And this is where, unfortunately, we've got over 1,000 Indigenous representative groups already giving advice to government. And you're going to add another one. If you wanted to separate it, and we've made this clear both privately and publicly, that if the question was around constitutional recognition, that Indigenous Australians were here first, that we made some mistakes, that we're better having been together and we'll be better sticking together, then I sense that not only the Nationals, but I can't speak for the Liberals, but I would suspect the Liberals would wholeheartedly support that as well. But when you try to put another layer of bureaucracy, it is us that will be the ones that be disadvantaged. It won't shift the dial because you're going to have 7 or 8 representatives of regional Australia. They're going to be representing hundreds of communities across hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. And you need to have a solution where Canberra bureaucracy goes and sit and designs a local solution with the local elders, empowering local elders and local councils in individual towns, not having someone go to Canberra and try to create that across hundreds of different communities, across hundreds of thousands of different square kilometres. It just practically hasn't worked, and it won't work again. And that's the mistakes of the past that we are revisiting here with this proposal.
What are your thoughts on the federal government recruiting Indigenous celebrities to campaign for the voice?
Oh, look, that's their prerogative, and I'm not too concerned about those great Indigenous Australians that have broken through and done great things for our country as great Australians. What I'm worried about are those Indigenous Australians in rural and remote communities where the disadvantage still exists. And this is the challenge, is we have done some great things. We put over $5 billion into Indigenous procurement programs. That means Indigenous businesses have got up and going, and they've also employed Indigenous people. We've got 97% of Indigenous children now going to kindergarten. We've made some big inroads, but the inroads haven't been made in those rural and remote areas. And while many of these Indigenous stars, I respect their right, and we should have a respectful conversation, I'm proud of what they've achieved. But what I'm concerned about are those Indigenous Australians in the remote communities that won't be able to close the gap, and that's what this should be about. If you want to entwine this, it has to be about closing the gap, and we've got lived experience. We are repeating history here, and those communities will be the ones that are left behind again.
On a broader scale, what would happen if this referendum doesn't succeed? We know 8 out of 44 referendums have been successful in Australian history. If it's a no, what message will this say to the rest of the world?
Well, what it says to the rest of the world is that we want to close the gap and do it with a better bureaucracy, not a bigger one. What it should also celebrate is while we've made some mistakes, we've been a great country having been together, and if we stick together. Now, if the Prime Minister wants to bring the country together, the opportunity is there for him to isolate these questions out and to have one around constitutional recognition. And I think that every Australian has that in their heart. But when you have to bring in place another layer of bureaucracy, then you have to think with your head about the implications that have, not just for the Indigenous people in remote communities, but also the fact that we're going to have constitutional challenges in courts moving forward. That's not how this should be achieved. We should do this in a sensible way, using common sense. And I think the rest of the world can look at what we have done and what we can do, and making sure that leadership is then the way through this, where the government takes control of the bureaucracy and sends them into these communities and sits them around campfires and around town halls with the elders in those individual communities, and actually design the programs for the challenges but the opportunities that lie in front of those communities. Not have some broad regional solution to this. That won't work. It hasn't worked before. And this is what we're saying to people that live in capital cities and living around the world. Look through the lens that the National Party does. We're the ones that represent these remote communities. We're the ones that have lived with the consequence of a representative body before and the failures that it brought. And that's why we're saying the lived experience is one that we just ask you to understand, to seek to understand. And if the question and the leadership after this will be, if it is a no, is about continuing to make sure the bureaucracy works better, but we'd be happy to continue on that conversation about constitutional recognition and what that set of words might look like into the future.
Let's turn topics. David Littleproud, rumours former Prime Minister Scott Morrison may quit politics and take on a consulting job overseas. What more do you know?
No, very little apart from what Andrew Clennell reported a month or so ago. And I think, obviously, Scott Morrison has been to the pinnacle of his political career. But if his heart's not in it, then it's important that he has that honest conversation with the people at Cook. Our democracy is a precious institution that should be protected at all costs, and we're given the privilege as custodians, as elected representatives, to make sure that institution is protected. So if Scott doesn't have it in his heart anymore to get out of bed and to fight for the people at Cook every morning and to do it with the passion and the fire that you'd expect, then it is time for him to decide to move on. And if it is, I wish him all the best.
And if this is the case, a by-election will be held, as you mentioned, the former PM seat of Cook. Do you think New South Wales Attorney General Mark Speakman, who is the leading candidate, will switch to federal politics if this by-election was to happen?
Yeah, I think that'll be the interesting lens in which this state election, a by-election would take place. Obviously, with the Liberals having lost government in New South Wales, there'll be plenty of state politicians that will be considering the opportunity to come to Canberra. I think it's important that no matter who they put, the lessons of Aston should be learnt, is that you need someone that's local, you need someone that's connected to that community, that is driven about its advancement, about the challenges and the opportunities that lay in that electorate. So I think no matter what the Liberals do, if Scott Morrison goes, the candidate should be someone that lives local. Localism is important, and that's what they expect in their representative that they send either to state or federal parliament, is that they believe in their community because they live in their community.
David, we are reporting on a story on cost of living and housing situation today, and a growing number of families in Queensland are being forced to sleep in their cars due to the rental crisis and rising cost of living. It's across the board, but several councils in Queensland have implemented new strategies, including funding a sleeping bus and providing shower options. At St Vincent de Paul in Queensland, they're resorting to paying car registration fees to help families stay together, following the news that more than 10 million middle-income earners are set to face one of the largest tax increases in history. This sounds like it could potentially be getting worse.
Yeah, look, I mean, on a planning level, this has been an abject failure of state and local governments for decades. They hold the planning pen. And the fact that we've got a shortage of housing has shown that bureaucracy has got in the way at state and local government level. And to come up with some band-aid solutions, while is admirable, the fact is we need more supply. And that supply needs to also be pragmatic, having a pragmatic conversation with those that want to live in capital cities. If you live in a capital city, you may not be on the quarter-acre block that you used to be. It might have to go up, and we may have to have greater density of living with unit complexes rather than trying to go out and take up landscape, particularly productive agricultural landscape. So there's a real challenge here that state and local governments have really got to get moving on. They've dropped the ball on this. But in terms of the tax cuts that's coming that have been taken away, this is a cost of living crisis that this government has been blaming everyone for 12 months, but their actions, in fact, have fueled much of the inflation. They're going to have a $45 billion gorilla hit the capital markets in borrowing off-budget items for 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines that you'll end up paying for as well in your electricity bill. They haven't been able to work through with energy companies, particularly gas, in increasing supply. So supply's gone down. We've been drawing down on gas reserves, and so prices have been going up. And instead of being at war with the gas companies, instead of working with them, increasing supply, putting pressure down on prices of energy, they've gone up. And that's also fed through to your grocery bill. The processing sector is paying a lot more for their energy to process the food and fibre that you enjoy. So this government's actions is leading to the inflationary pressures. And that's why we had challenges supporting some of the legislation they put through, whether that be on the manufacturing, $15 billion of borrowed money, $10 billion for the housing, and $25 billion in the first tranche of transmission lines, all of which they've got to pay interest for, and then try and get a return. And you're not spending all that on housing and manufacturing. They're trying to make a return above the interest they're paying. But when you put $45 billion into the competitive capital market, that means that it's pushing prices up in your mortgage every time they go to borrow more. So this is where the government can take real action without it costing the taxpayer a lot, if they're sensible and make sensible, common sense solutions to it by not having inflationary pressure by the decisions they make.
David Littleproud, we have to wrap it up, but before we let you go, we've got about 10 seconds to go. Would you like to share any Easter messages to our viewers today?
Oh, look, have a holy but safe and happy Easter, and just reflect on how lucky you are to live in this great country and to be with your family and friends. Have a great Easter.
Nationals leader David Littleproud, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.